Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library royallib.com, https://royallib.com. All books by the author, https://royallib.com/author/Severyukhin_Demetri.html. The same book in other formats, https://royallib.com/book/Severyukhin_Demetri/Mitino_shas.html. Enjoy reading. Demetrius Severyukhin. Mitino Happiness. Tragics based on pictures by Alexander Kobiak. Mitino slowly glided along Gagrinskaya, over its chipped pavement, which all the time remained about a palm's width from his soles. Heavy lace-up boots rose and fell smoothly, neatly avoiding countless potholes, motley wads of wrapping foil, empty cigarette boxes, and crumpled beer cans stuck in the rare islands of melted snow. Ahead, slightly to the left, ran, standing apart from Mitino, his shadow, constantly changing outlines and cheerfully spreading over the surface of objects that came across on the way. In order not to embarrass the infrequent passers-by at this time, he slightly moved his legs, imitating walking. But, as usual, neither sluggish pensioners, nor young mothers pushing their unyielding carriages to the gates of the summer garden, nor noisy flocks of first-graders running towards them paid any attention to him and did not notice the strangeness of the method of transportation he had chosen. Mitino passed a smoky yellow building with intricate stucco framing the windows, left behind him a garden with freshly painted roller coasters, and past a group of old low houses that stood out picturesquely against the backdrop of gloomy firewalls rising behind them. He had no definite business, and only a simple desire to circle around the quarters dear to his heart attracted him forward. He was forever in love with their touching squalor, with the proud gloom of echoing gateways inhabited by cats, with the luxury of dilapidated facades with once elegant cornices, semi-columns and openwork balconies, with intricate attics and towers that were completely unnecessary for local residents, looking at him with empty eye sockets windows. Having reached the crossroads, Mitino turned to the right and, at the silent signal of the stucco putty, lurking on the cornice of the corner house, closed his eyes so as not to suffocate with the wide expanse of the Neva, which for a moment looked to the left in the broken perspective of the street, resting on the embankment. For some reason, this expanse from childhood was unbearably terrible for Mitino, who grew up in the stuffy embrace of his grandmother's apartment, among bookcases, chests of drawers, heavy window curtains and a lot of old-fashioned, obsolete things. The Neva seemed to him a harbinger of the boundless expanse of the gulf, which, in turn, seemed to be the last threshold of earthly existence, the very flesh of alluring and frightening infinity. There, far beyond the city limit, lay for him the axis of the incomprehensible tangentoid of time, leading into a dark abyss that threatens to swallow the meaning of his material life. He knew that in these not quite ordinary flights he was doomed to circle in a closed labyrinth of painfully familiar city walls, where the close breathing of free space is only vaguely guessed by the rapid movement of low-flying clouds, by the melancholy cries of seagulls flying overhead and by the light breeze of the wind-pierced drops of river water. Mitino heard and even knew something about the magical soaring in the mountainous heights, from where the seas and rivers, hills and plains appear as shapeless spots of a geographical atlas, and the high arc of the horizon imperceptibly disappears, dissolving in the darkening sphere of the heavens. But he sacredly treasured his modest gift. It gave him joy to easily glide over the frozen ground, melted snow, asphalt, over this littered and broken pavement. He liked to peer into the concentrated grey faces of the townspeople, listen to the unintelligible dissonance of street noise and breathe in the ever-changing range of city smells. Only here, near the ground itself, could Mitino observe the whimsical run of his shadow, which had separated from the body and therefore, as it seemed, did not always follow his movements exactly. For a long time he had perceived the shadow as a faithful companion, constantly accompanying him on flights, as a silent companion and an indispensable witness to these walks. As if obeying some unwritten rule, with the disappearance of the shadow, he descended to the ground and returned to everyday life. So today, moving from the crossroads to the right along Sergiyevskaya, towards the sun, he was forced to leave a shadow behind his back, and after a minute or two he completely lost sight of it and, heavily rearranging his slightly numb legs, dejectedly wandered alone to the house. "Stop fantasizing, Mitino. I have already heard all this, and more than once," my grandmother said with undisguised irritation, not wanting to be distracted from the French book, which in that year, the last year of her life, she reread in a circle. "Your inventions, my friend, are obscenely intrusive and boring." Her eyebrows, almost fused at the bridge of her nose, were furrowed more than usual, and the corners of her arrogantly pursed lips sank into sharply marked, vertically cut folds of her cheeks. Grandmother did not approve of Mitya's too frank manifestation of high impulses, considering this a sign of a weak character and a dangerous symptom of mental instability. Emotional restraint and maintaining a certain distance in the manifestation of feelings, even between the closest people, were for her an unshakable norm of behavior. She did not like Mitya's stories about magical flights. She was frightened by the serious conviction and agitation that accompanied his muddled speech. Mitya, on the other hand, was not at all a crazy dreamer who wanted to involve someone in his inventions at all costs. But flights over the pavement were no less a reality for him than all the unrecognized chaos of everyday life surrounding him, and he sometimes felt a keen desire to tell someone about those happy moments of spiritual clarity that fate sometimes bestowed on him in a dream or in reality. However, languid and irrelevant words could not convey even a small fraction of his innermost feelings. That is why, whenever he started a conversation unpleasant for his grandmother, he was finally forced to be silent in embarrassment. Parents left Mitya when he was 7 years old. Their simultaneous departure has forever remained for Mitya one of those mysteries that do not need an answer, and subsequent years have taught him to ignore the vague hints and omissions associated with this event. He was accustomed to ignoring the idle whispering behind his back and with the same indifference accepted both the malicious teasing of knowledgeable classmates and the sentimental sympathy of adults. In truth, Mitya did not experience the real hardships of orphanhood. He could not complain about his abandonment, since for a long time he was the only representative of the younger generation in a very branched family clan. Moreover, Mitya unconsciously felt like a happy child, although he could hardly explain what, in fact, his happiness consists of. Home comfort, relative material well-being, accompanying Mitton's life from the first steps, were not even noticed by him. The same indisputable reality for Mitya was not too interested in his studies at school, which meant mandatory involvement in the sometimes cheerful, but often obscure world of children's communication. Tests, dictations and exams made him nervous, and the rare calls to the blackboard plunged him into almost painful embarrassment. Festive wall newspapers, amateur circles, sports, health days in the Tauride garden, cultural trips to a museum or theater did not cause delight in Mitya, and he preferred quiet solitude to fickle and annoying school friendships. Like all children, the grandmother who took care of Mitya knew how to combine the severity of Petersburg home education with the maximum good nature and warmth that was allowed by the age-old family tradition. She encouraged his reading in every possible way. She herself compiled a list of necessary books, knew how to choose a good poem for memorization, took his short passion for drawing with emphatic seriousness, carefully keeping his lyried gouaches, and gave him the first lessons of French, which, however, over time was completely supplanted by Mitya by a surrogate for English, hastily swallowed for the sake of familiarizing with computer wisdom. However, the sober rationalism of grandmother's upbringing was not elevated to an absolute and at least once a year allowed concessions, which also had a traditional basis. These indulgences were associated with the New Year holiday, which, as is well known, involves a certain amount of sublime self-deception and conditional belief in fairy tale magic. That is why Mitton's whole life was covered with the image and spirit of Santa Claus, who was not at all for him only a hero of children's books and cartoons. Santa Claus was perceived by Mitya as a kind of higher and fairer substance, as the only righteous god, whose metaphysical existence was as certain for him as his own weightless flights. Perhaps Mitino's happiness was rooted in the belief, absorbed from childhood, in some kind of indefinite joy of future events associated with Santa Claus, which must definitely happen in his life, filling it with an extremely important meaning. At a precisely measured time, with happy inevitability, Santa Claus appeared to Mitya, not paying attention to all his childhood sins, pranks and whims, lost mittens and an unclean children's room, mediocre grades for a quarter and even impudent words, for some reason said to grandmother. He was always ready to patiently listen to the timid recitation of a quatrain hastily learned by Mitya, and with generous indulgence took note of Mitya's untimely colds, which often forced him, to the general displeasure of adults, to spend the holiday in bed. The appearance of Santa Claus was changeable and did not always correspond to the common icons of New Year's cards, but a snow-white cotton beard was present without fail. This luxurious beard, slightly strayed to one side, dangled around the neck of a tipsy mass entertainer in fashionable sneakers instead of canonical felt boots, or almost completely covered the mouth of some elderly woman, from under whose suspicious red sheepskin coat for some reason peeped her grandmother's apron. But, of course, it was not this changeable and ephemeral earthly incarnation of Father Frost that worried Mitya. Much more important was the indescribable feeling of a wonderful holiday associated with it, saturated with the coniferous spirit and the thick aroma of various grandmother's delicacies. How Mitya liked to decorate the Christmas tree the day before, taking turns taking old Christmas decorations from the dilapidated box, among which there simply could not be unloved ones. How his heart sank from the cheerful crowd of noisy guests entering the narrow hallway. What delight did the lively adult feast, colored by incomprehensible to him, but still very funny jokes, lead to. How he loved the midnight triumph of the national anthem, accompanied by the indispensable rising, and the sea of fizzy lemonade, and the heady sip of bittersweet champagne allowed by his grandmother, and the endlessly long night, illuminated by flashes of sparklers, firecrackers and capricious Christmas tree garland. And, of course, gifts that were always found under the tree only the next day, closer to dinner, when the first New Year's morning was already beginning to flow imperceptibly into the evening. Santa Claus never let Mitya down. Unwrapping colored paper packages and opening boxes, he never felt the slightest disappointment. Here, at the Christmas tree cross, abundantly sprinkled with confetti and prematurely fallen needles, the most desirable toys, tempting and mysterious games, books with bright covers and exciting titles, magnificent drawing supplies, many, many cute and useful little things like a penknife, flashlight or binoculars. Having said goodbye to children's toys long ago, Mitya stubbornly maintained a naive devotion to the New Year's ritual. Once a year, for a moment, tightly closing his eyes, he would certainly make his most important wish, which was sure to come true at the behest of a fabulous patron, who carefully and sensitively followed his changing tastes and passions. As in his distant childhood, Mitya continued to consider himself the chosen one of Santa Claus and was internally convinced that it was Santa Claus who determined the turns of his fate, suggested the right path, and pushed him to the most important and responsible decisions. "Mitya, Mitya, wake up!" Janechka chirped with a note of reproach in her voice, vigorously tugging at his shoulder. She always mistook for a dream that blissful fading with which, slightly closing his eyes, he absorbed the morning warmth of her body and listened to the barely perceptible beating of the heart close to him. "Well, wake up, Mitya!" Janechka repeated resentfully, trying with weak hands to turn him over on his back so that, leaning on his chest, she could look sternly into his face. The time was approaching noon. The December sun was already generously warming the small bedroom, and its slanting rays, passing through the wide multi-leaf window, merrily played with light dust, creating an almost impenetrable light canopy near the bed. The early rattle of janitor shovels outside the window was replaced by the growing noise of city transport. At the crossroads of Lydany and Kiroknaya, fussy drivers honked irritably to each other, and the steel rattle of trams more and more often responded with a cheerful crystal chime in the sideboard. Janechka had long been bored with this prolonged Saturday morning. She was eager to get out of the stuffy bed, quickly put herself in order and plunge into the pleasant worries of the day off. She was completely in anticipation of the upcoming evening, which promised to be very eventful for her, and any delay created the risk of crumpling and shortening the approaching pleasure. Mitya, of course, remembered that Janechka was going to a country party of her old company today, and he should have quickly prepared her favorite coffee with toasted bread, helped pack things, buy something for the journey and see her off at the Finland station. But he lingered for a long time with the final awakening, admiring through the mist of eyelashes the angry curve of Janechka's slightly parted lips and enjoying the airy touch of her dark flowing hair. Finally, Mitya slowly opened his short-sighted eyes, gently grabbed Jinya by the shoulders and carefully pulled her to him. His chest was filled with the bright delight of the desired intimacy, and his face, bordered by the reddish fluff of a failed beard, broke into a happy smile. But Janechka annoyedly freed herself from his untimely embrace and busily and somewhat defiantly set about her usual morning ritual. Obeying her will, he sadly said goodbye to the longed-for bliss and, shuffling awkwardly fastened slippers, dutifully wandered into the dressing room. Mitya met Janechka last December, on the very eve of the new year, when sad thoughts about unbearably dreary loneliness squeezed his heart with special force. Janechka grew up in Blagoveshchensk, lost among the deserted Manchurian hills, a strange and lovely town, which, for reasons of border secrecy, turned its back on the waters of the mighty Amur. She arrived in St. Petersburg with a somewhat naive intention of entering the Theatre Institute, but either she was late for the entrance exams, or she lost the necessary documents, and by the time they met, she had been looking for some not too burdensome work for 6 months, sleeping and feeding alternately with random acquaintances. At some point, the turn came to Mitya, about whom Janechka heard from mutual friends who remembered him in connection with the search for a place for New Year's festivities. After the death of his grandmother, Mitya lived alone in an apartment too large for him on Lideny Prospect, opposite a house covered with literary legends in the style of fictional Moorish architecture. The once cozy family nest now bore a clear imprint of bachelor life, and the computer that reigned almost in the middle of the living room was sharply knocked out of the old-fashioned atmosphere that kept the memory of several generations of St. Petersburg. The apartment, which aroused the outright envy of Mitya's peers, soon turned into a favorite place for idle pastime of close and not too close friends, who had nowhere else to have fun, chat or just drink a bottle of wine. The guests, whom Mitya sometimes did not even know by name, began to literally overcome him. They were at any moment capable of destroying solitude, not at all interested in his mood and plans. Waking up after another forced fun, he always felt inner emptiness and a new surge of depressing feelings of loneliness. With the advent of Genya, everything changed. Entering Mitya's house with New Year's magic, she not only became the only object of his adoration and care, but completely transformed life, which from now on was filled with a new exceptional meaning for Mitya. Janechka became a kind of connecting thread between Mitya and the rest of the world, from which he had long been shielded by a veil of indifferent alienation and short-sighted absent-mindedness. As if spellbound, Mitya admired the unique plasticity of Janechka's movements, was ready to laugh uncontrollably at her every joke and watched with delight how she spoke with street cats in all seriousness and fed careless sparrows from the palm of her hand. He liked to hold her childishly small fingers in his hands or sort through her dark hair, inhaling their amazing aroma. He listened with pleasure to the ironic intonation of Janechka's hoarse-low voice, which so strangely contrasted with her fragile figure. Laying his head on Janechka's knees, he could listen for hours to her stories about dreams in which she flies over mountain ranges, nameless hills and endless forest expanses, cut through by the windings of winding rivers, high, high above the earth, gradually floating away into the multi-star expanses of the universe. The company Janechka longed for on that sunny December morning was almost unfamiliar to Mitya. Only once, back in June, Janechka took him with her to one of those house parties that were held in Takhovka, in a rickety wooden house crowned with a funny turret with a round window. There, in a spacious room with dilapidated walls and unsightly furniture, 10 or 12 of Janechka's friends and girlfriends gathered, who considered themselves, rather in their inner worldview than in professional affiliation, as artists, philosophers and poets. Their paintings, scholarly treatises and poems were probably still ahead, but for now some of them were listed as students, and some, considering higher education to be superfluous, were interrupted by odd jobs or enjoyed the generous benevolence of their parents. The owner of the house, a tall and plump brunette Grisha, a former student of the director's department, was noticeably older than the others and kept a leader in the company. He hospitably courted Mitya and asked about his work with marked interest, constantly filling his glass with tart port wine. "You, computer scientists, probably have something like a secret brotherhood," Grisha spoke with a half-interrogative intonation, demonstrating a fine command of the rules of secular conversation. "After all, you are, in essence, a closed caste that holds in its hands the threads of control of all world development." He peered into Mitina's short-sighted eyes with mock attentiveness, as if trying to see the reflection of his own face in his pupils. But Mitya could not tell anything at all about any computer fraternity, or about these mysterious threads of control, and, smiling helplessly, all the time looked for Genya with his eyes. She, voluntarily taking on the role of hostess, brewed tea with apparent pleasure, busied herself at the smoked stove and disposed of the circulation of various dacha dishes of various sizes. All night long, Mitya listened intently to a table conversation that was little understandable to him, in which theories and facts unknown to him were mentioned, books he had not read and films he had not watched, terms, names and titles that were familiar to him, but not entirely clear in meaning. Instinctively, he felt out of place here and, in order to get rid of the oppressive feeling of awkwardness, he tried several times to join in the general conversation, inserting random remarks at random. However, with each remark, the awkwardness only intensified, and in the end there was nothing left for him but to completely surrender to the action of alcohol and doze peacefully in a comfortable armchair. No, of course, Mitya did not at all consider himself an uncultured person. He loved to read, knew many poems by heart and sometimes even tried to compose something himself. True, he would not have been able to properly retell even the simplest literary plot and for a long time did not try to trust anyone with his impressions, hiding them in the depths of his memory. And the books from the huge grandmother's library surrounding him since childhood were probably not quite the same. In any case, they did not guarantee full entry into Janechkin's circle. After graduating from the institute, Mitino worked for 2 years as a software engineer in a small private office engaged in designing advertising. The work, which would have seemed like a boring routine to another, unexpectedly fell in love with him, because it did not require career efforts, but assumed calm concentration, which was quite consistent with his character. We can say that this work was for him a continuation of some kind of quiet childish game associated with an endless rearrangement of pictures and geometric shapes, collecting intricate digital and letter combinations. Mitino was well aware that the ordinary technical education, which was given to him with great difficulty, to put it mildly, did not contribute to the expansion of cultural horizons. The humanitarian sphere seemed to him a huge unknown planet, and all those who were more or less involved in it seemed to be almost demiurges, invested with the magic of the highest knowledge, before which his modest mind trembled. But all these considerations, alas, did not in the least excuse Mitya's unusual drunken drowsiness and such obviously revealed ignorance, for which Janechka was so sulky all the next morning. Or maybe she was even more angry because of his ridiculous appearance, which unfavorably singled out Mitya among her friends. He noticed that even before she was a little embarrassed by his short, round-shouldered figure, on which any clothes seemed to be from someone else's shoulder, that she was annoyed by his glasses falling to the tip of his nose and his sparse hair, always uncombed, with an emerging bald patch. Now, to the number of Mitya's shortcomings were added an inability to show off his mind and a stupid habit of falling into silent thoughtfulness. Feeling acutely ashamed of his behavior at night, Mitya nevertheless managed to beg Janechka's forgiveness that morning and persuaded her to break away from the company for a while to take a walk with him alone. Passing ramshackle country houses and rickety fences, they crossed a ridge of sand dunes with crooked stunted pines and came out to the bay, which then appeared before them only motionless shallow water, merging with the sky at the horizon. Hand in hand, they walked along a deserted sandy beach littered with dry reeds, and inhaled the spicy smell of green algae, and then, throwing off their clothes, walked for a long, long time in lukewarm water along a shallow velvety bottom, until the mirror surface hid them to the waist. There, with merry cries, they frolicked like children, jumped and drowned each other, and then, throwing their legs high above the water, they galloped to the shore together. That marvelous summer day, like many other hours and minutes spent together with Genya, was added to that very innermost part of Mitya's bright memories, from which the foundation of his life was woven. True, since then, on Saturdays, Janechka prudently went to Takhovka alone, and returned from there only late on Sunday evening, forcing Mitya to spend the whole weekend in painful, dreary expectation. Half a year had passed since that memorable trip to Takhovka, and now, on a sunny December day, Mitya did not at all imagine that he was seeing Janechka to the Finland station for the last time and that the brief history of their happy union was inexorably approaching a bleak conclusion. Janechka did not return home on Sunday. She did not make herself known on Monday, or on Tuesday, or in the following days. Mitya sat in vain in the evenings by the telephone, shuddering from the hoarse chime of the wall clock and listening with unaccountable hope to the noise of a passing elevator, vainly leaving touching notes on the kitchen table in the morning, vainly waiting for news from one of Janechka's little-known friends. Only 2 weeks later, on the very eve of the new year, an ugly plump girl, whom he had seen in the summer in Takhovka, ran up to him without warning, and now he could not remember her name. "Just don't worry, please, please don't worry," she quickly chattered, preventing Mitya from concentrating. "Everything is fine with Genya. She misses your home very, very much and certainly, do you hear? We'll be back to you soon. But right now, the girl's whitish eyes widened expressively, and her speech became more and more verbose and confused. You need to be patient a little more, because Genya, due to very, very difficult and important circumstances for her, cannot appear with you and therefore, she asks you to hand over to her as soon as possible all the things you have left of her." With a sinking heart, Mitya rushed to collect Janechka's clothes, hastily folded them into a large sports bag and tried to escort the nameless messenger to the tram. But she somehow quickly said goodbye to him on the threshold of the hallway and silently disappeared with the bag in the darkness of the stairway, leaving behind a slight smell of sweat, to which for some reason the barely distinguishable dope of Janechka's perfume was mixed. Mitya, of course, knew where Genya could certainly be found, or at least get reliable information about her fate. No, not in her native border blug of Yeshchensk, separated from Mitya by thousands of kilometers of deserted forest space, but much closer, just an hour and a half drive from his house. But this distance suddenly turned out to be irresistibly distant and frightening for Mitya, fraught with bleak trials. Unknown to Mitya in previous years, gloomy forebodings paralyzed his will, inexplicable inaction threatened to drag on forever, and senseless painful expectations continued to torment his soul. The empty apartment surrounded Mitya with an alarming silence, the familiar old-fashioned atmosphere no longer warmed with its comfort, and the sun's rays no longer tried to break through the heavy dusty curtains. The work lost all interest for Mitya. The next official task lay without movement, and only a playful screensaver on the monitor screen appealed to his work conscience with carefree monotony. Neither old friends who once bothered Mitya, nor long-distant relatives, nor colleagues concerned about business, were interested in his personal life, and he did not have to count on a heart-to-heart conversation that would allow him to unlock some internal bolts and throw out all the bitterness of accumulated feelings. Mitya realized that he would never again be able to soar above the littered and broken, but still dear to his heart, St. Petersburg pavement. It seemed that his own shadow, a faithful companion of magical weightless walks, challenged him and firmly adhered to his legs, forever pressing them to the ground. In hopeless dreams and dreams, Mitya saw how he was again celebrating the New Year's holiday, sacred to him, together with Genya, and he was ready to sacrifice a lot, if only these dreams and dreams would come true. But, vaguely guessing the real price of the required sacrifice, Mitya only on the very last day of the outgoing year ventured to take a decisive step, designed to free him from the darkness of painful ignorance. All New Year's Eve, Mitya had to push through at the Finland station, because, as it turned out-of-town trains were cancelled, and it was possible to get to Takhovka only by an early morning flight. The spacious hall was abundantly hung with flashing garlands to somehow brighten up this night for the merry and tipsy people who were languishing here, who for various reasons found themselves far from the home festive table. Outbursts of desperate laughter here and there were interspersed with muffled shots of cheap champagne, disposable plastic cups swirling around as if they were entering into a round dance of eternal life, and lines of open cans, weathered chicken legs and sticky sandwiches lined up on greasy newspaper tablecloths that thickly covered the benches. Mitya automatically joined in the pandemonium of the general holiday, with absent-minded indifference, accepting the treats offered and smiling inappropriately at all the remarks addressed to him. Like most of the participants in this station feast, he felt like a bum. In the morning, having reached the farthest carriage, Mitya sat alone by the window and, closing his eyes, thoughtfully buried his forehead in the pleasantly chilling glass. The unaccustomed silence of the half-empty car after a noisy and restless night seemed unsettling to him, and he impatiently began to wait for the booming rumble of the closing doors that preceded departure. Ta-ta-ta, 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 the wheels finally rattled monotonously, slowly beating out the difficult rhythm of three measures. A deserted platform floated outside the window. Dull office buildings, entwined with a bizarre ornament of diverging iron tracks, flashed a little faster. The uncomfortable backyards of the Vibek side appeared in the distance, and soon liquid birch copses, breaks in crooked fences and motley houses of an extended suburban area blackening among snow-covered gardens. Ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta. The three-beat rhythm continued to beat faster, and Mitya involuntarily began to think of the counting rhyme in the spirit of those rhymed absurdities with which he had once then he tried to ingratiate himself with his classmates who did not like him. Now, however, the lines, subordinated to the given rhythmic pattern, began to take shape by themselves in a certain semantic sequence, colored by the minor scale of Mitya's mood. Having reached the 20th line, Mitya confidently put an end to it and decided to write down what he had thought up on a New Year's card folded in half with a fake Santa Claus put into his pocket by one of the participants in the station fun. Overcoming the coordinated resistance of the wagon shaking, foggy glasses and a frozen ballpoint pen, Mitya somehow coped with this task, but, after rereading his essay, he immediately became embarrassed by its excessive seriousness. Wanting to somehow soften the dramatic pathos inappropriate for the counting rhyme, he, after thinking for a minute, completed it with a tricky stanza, reminiscent of a verse from a sentimental thug song. And already at the entrance to his station, he managed to densely fill the free field of the postcard with a caricature drawing, which, if desired, could serve as the key to reading the rhyme. Having strayed at random around the village, Mitya finally approached a familiar, slightly rickety house, crowned with a funny turret, from the round window of which a wonderful view of the Gulf must have opened. The chimney was resting, but the path leading to the house was well trodden, the porch was neatly cleared of snow, and a plastic bag with fresh garbage leaning against the steps betrayed a human presence. Mitya with an effort opened the unyielding wooden door, upholstered in the old style with flat metal ornamentation, passed the cramped entrance hall with a dark staircase leading upstairs, threw back the thick cloth canopy and stepped into the spacious room familiar to him. Here, among the dilapidated walls and unsightly furniture, a company of Janechka's friends settled down, spending the post-holiday morning in an almost inaudible, lazy, empty conversation. Mitya nodded absently to everyone at once and clumsily began to wipe his misted glasses, not responding to the polite invitation to take a seat at the table. Looking around short-sightedly and not seeing Janechka, he stepped back into the passage and began leisurely climbing the steep stairs into the unknown darkness of the attic. An ugly plump girl, whose name Mitya could not remember, ran out after him and, with the help of wordy and confusing explanations, persistently tried to stop him. Inappropriately answering her with something like a greeting, he stubbornly climbed a dozen high steps, passed along the creaky upper corridor and in the dark stumbled upon a tightly closed door, behind which some kind of life was guessed. Noiselessly opening it, he was momentarily blinded by the bright sunlight pouring from the round window, and found himself at the threshold of a small room littered with all sorts of country rubbish. On the ottoman, above a pile of randomly crumpled bed linen, stood the mighty figure of Grisha in a wide-open motley shirt, which exposed his belly, glistening from the moisture of perspiration. He was on his knees, deeply buried in the soft folds of the blanket, and made powerful movements with his torso, accompanying each jerk with a muffled wheeze. Janechka's face pressed against the sheet, barely visible through the thick network of loose hair, shone with delight, her eyes were closed, and her slightly smiling lips moved in incoherent lamentation. Mitya silently froze at the opening of the half-open door, staring numbly at the tightly joined bodies of lovers who did not notice his presence. Their coordinated vigorous movements resembled some kind of ritual action, methodically expressing the triumph of natural animal passion, or rather, the ruthless cynicism of human lust. How strikingly different was this rough, aggressive manifestation of male power from his, Mitya's, quiveringly tender and, probably, completely inept behavior in moments of bodily intimacy. How absurd now seemed to Mitya his eternal fear of inconveniencing Janechka with his clumsiness, his sudden abrupt movement. How out of place was his persistent desire to always see her face in front of him, to peer into the elusive movements of her lips and eyes, to feel the gentle warmth of her breath. And with what naive credulity he always listened to her passionate sighs and exaggerated praises. For a brief moment, Mitya was seized by an almost irresistible desire to suddenly reveal himself noisily and, having pressed Grisha in some unthinkable way, immediately intervene in the observed action in order to, just as he, roughly, in an animal way, take possession of Janechka's body, squeeze and torment her in his arms in the midst of all this country rubbish, so incompatible with the manifestation of truly high feelings. But the fleeting obsession immediately disappeared, leaving behind only a vague feeling of virginal youthful shame and inexplicable disgust. The growing pace of movements was already bringing the love ritual to its highest point, when Mitya, who had remained unnoticed, forced himself to recoil into the semi-darkness of the stairs and, with difficulty maintaining his balance, languidly slid down after his own dim shadow. Beatrice, who was waiting for Mitya in the hallway, he finally remembered the strange name of Janechka's ugly friend, although her face was erased from memory at that very moment, again tried to briskly impose her unnecessary explanations on him, but he silently thrust into her palm a postcard folded in half with his counting rhyme and went away from home. No, it was not at all sadness from the inevitable parting with her beloved, not the burning shame of an obvious male defeat, not the pain of an experienced insult and not the fury of disgusting jealousy from that moment incinerated Midden's soul. Mitya suddenly realized with all clarity the complete collapse of his world, which had once fascinated him with an indescribable feeling of an approaching holiday and was illuminated for him by joyful magic and love. He saw that this love turned into an empty pretense, an unbearably cruel joke, and the gloomy forebodings that oppressed him received undeniable confirmation. It seemed to him that not only Janechka's insincere friends were involved in this hypocritical conspiracy against him, but also the restless station drunkards, and the rare passers-by he met last night, and the uncomfortable empty carriage, and the silent snow-covered road, and the coastal road dozing in the morning bliss. The village, and this winter morning itself, presented, as if in a mockery of it, in dazzling sunny splendor. All the threads connecting Mitya with an ordinary earthly life common to all were torn from that moment. In this common life, almost unknown to him, Mitya felt himself completely superfluous and useless, some forgotten, old, unnecessary Christmas tree toy, which will never please anyone with its iridescent brilliance, will never again be hung on the Christmas tree. Going out into the yard, Mitya skirted the intricate labyrinth of a fallen picket fence and confidently headed in the direction where the round window of the just-abandoned turret looked out. In his temples, the rapid rhythm of the heart was unusually reverberating, his eyes watered from the dazzling snow shine, his nostrils burned from the fresh coolness, which foreshadowed an imminent meeting with the Gulf. Dilapidated country houses and skewed fences were left behind, the terrain gradually decreased, but the humpbacked dunes hid the icebound water plain from Mitino for a long time. Finally, he climbed the last sandy ridge covered with a fragile porous crust and saw the naked snow-covered field of the Gulf stretching for many kilometers, which merged with the milky veil of heaven, making one believe in the proximity of the unimagined edge of the earth. Mitino accepted with all his being the long-awaited picture, expressing his ideas about the real flesh of infinite space, but this picture no longer frightened him. Absorbing the breath of the Gulf, Mitino began to perform mechanically unusual, but long thought out and therefore well understood actions. The nearest pine tree, which he noticed back in the summer, tilted, like all its neighbors, towards the ice-covered beach, hospitably stretched out its knotty branches, which began almost from the very interlacing of powerful roots high up from the ground. Mitino threw off his jacket on the snow and, peeling off his hands unfamiliar with rough work, began to quickly climb up. Having reached the thickest, almost horizontal branch, he saddled it and leaned his back against the trunk. He threw a loop of a long-prepared thick silk cord with a special slip knot around his neck, over the invention of which he had to rack his brains pretty much. It remained to tie the cord around the chosen branch, having previously estimated by eye the free length necessary for a strong jerk that could instantly relieve pain. Having completed this simple task, Mitino again leaned back against the trunk, threw back his face up and, rubbing his hands aching from the cold and abrasions, relaxed in melancholy calmness. The sun, breaking through the thinnest tracing of clouds, rose over the Gulf, approaching the highest point. The first New Year's afternoon in Mitch's life was approaching, which did not promise him gifts from Santa Claus, who, it seems, had turned away from him forever. Mitino took this bitter fact with an unexpected ease and began to listen indifferently to the sounds from the direction of the village, which was gradually waking up after a protracted festive night. The rare cries of seagulls flying over Mitino were replaced by distant echoes of children's laughter and a good-natured family squabble, the annoying noise of a car engine warming up, the monotonous creak of an iron swing, the endless roll call of dogs, the roar of alarmed jackdaws and the booming thud of an axe that echoes obediently. Time has already stopped for Mitino. He was not going to hesitate with the decision taken the day before, which was supposed to free him from the unbearable anguish of a lonely and aimless existence. "Janechka! Girl, what is this?" Mitino muttered aloud, quite sure that she heard him, that she was here, that she was silent only because she had not yet understood the irreparable horror of all that she had done. It doesn't matter, Janechka," he whispered bitterly and tenderly in the end, and then abruptly moved his body forward, turned freely around the branch and rushed to the ground, to meet with infinity. For a brief moment, Mitino plunged into the longed-for absolute of darkness, but this sweet bliss of nothingness was suddenly replaced by a stream of light that burst into his consciousness. The clumsily tied knot slipped smoothly, treacherously softening the deadly jerk and stretching to the utmost the unfamiliar pain that squeezed his throat and pierced his body from the back of his head to the waist. The legs, shod in heavy-laced boots, twitched and hung helplessly, swaying near the ground, about a palm's width from the dried sedge protruding from under the snow and ice crust. Down there, on the snow, separately from him, his shadow slowly and stupidly moved from side to side, almost touching the body hovering above the ground. Mitino was seized with a chilling fear, and he thought that in this state he could hang here for an eternity. He wanted to grab onto the slippery cord behind his head and, pulling himself up on it, get to the saving crossbar. But the branch was now too high, and his hands had lost sensation and of their own accord were thrust forward absurdly with convulsively clenched fists, as if grasping the handlebars of an invisible bicycle. Losing consciousness from despair, pain and suffocation, Mitino, as in childhood, closed his eyes for a moment and forced himself to focus on his most important desire. He suddenly realized with the utmost clarity how indescribably he longed to look into Janechka's face and catch in it at least a faint reflection of the former feeling. With wide eyes, he scanned the landscape around him for the last time, starting with his own jacket lying nearby and snow-covered glasses. Now the Gulf was behind him, and in front of his face appeared a string of dunes overgrown with young pines with multicolored debris plentifully showing through the snowy whiteness. The path that led him here went beyond the nearest hill, reappeared and hid again, as if luring him back to that fairy tale world where simple happiness depends so much on shared love, home comfort and joyful gifts. Santa Claus did not let him down. At the farthest end of the winding path, at the limit of his short-sighted vision, Mitino managed to make out a group of people fussily running in his direction. In front of everyone, constantly bogged down in a crust of deceptive crust and awkwardly holding the long sleeves of Grisha's jacket thrown over his shoulders, Janechka ran towards him. The dark hair swept in the wind almost completely hid Janechka's beautiful face, but Mitya had no doubt that there were tears of compassion and love in her eyes. Mitino counter. On the threshold of the earthly stage. Release me from the shadow. Tie with a thin thread to the earth. With a quiet forest, with a wave of the sea, I will freeze over a deaf path. Between a pebble and a blade of grass. Like a glass ball on a tree. Like a fragile paper lantern. Like a bug in a thin web, you walk around me. Santa Claus or God Almighty tells me that the third one is superfluous. I will return to you with light snow. Sad dreams with golden bliss. Summer sun, sea sand. A gentle note, a magic line. Fresh bread, coffee spirit. Blue poplar fluff. The long-awaited light in the window. Sparrow on your palm, you once loved me. There is no return to the forgotten. I loved you unrequited. Let me go unnoticed. About this book. Here, in St. Petersburg, we often have the same dreams, permeated with the romantic veil of literary reminiscences and the bitter expectation of a prosaic awakening. Which of us at least once did not make a magical flight over the littered and broken, but still dear to his heart St. Petersburg pavement? For whom Santa Claus was not a reliable metaphysical reality, and parting with his carnival mask was a sad sign of inevitable growing up. Who has never tried to sort things out with his own shadow? Who has not experienced delight at the sight of an endless expanse of water surrounding the city and merging with the sky at the horizon? In a word, it will not be difficult for the reader to recognize himself in Mitya. Many will find the tragic ending of the story unbearable. Wouldn't it have been better to put a short explanation on the back of the cover, like the closing credits for Hollywood films, in the spirit that Mitya was saved, his spine was not injured at all. Beatrice who cared for him in the hospital. However, in the current version, the last scene leaves some optimistic chance for the main character, as in the case of his Bunin prototype, Mitya fired with pleasure. But did the shot take place? Dmitry Severyukhin, a former physicist and prolific electronics inventor, then a painter and exhibition organizer, has now gained fame as the author of monographs and reference books on Russian art, as well as the compiler of the fundamental history of the Leningrad Literary Samizdat, of which he himself was a participant in 1980s. And now, the debut of Severyukhin as a novelist, if you do not take into account a small booklet of his literary memoirs, 2 editions of which were recently published in a tiny edition and instantly became a bibliographic rarity. The style of book graphics by Alexander Kodiak, familiar to us from such different books as The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam and The History of a City by Saltykov-Shchedrin, undoubtedly goes back to the traditions of St. Petersburg, modern, more precisely, to the world of art, with its refined aestheticism, a pronounced decorative graphic trend and an emphasized desire for theatricality. In his favorite technique, ink drawings, Kodiak achieves graphic expressiveness due to the alternation of the thinnest lines, forming an openwork ligature, from which images and plots are generously woven. Pedantic adherence to a literary text is not characteristic of this master, and historical, ethnographic or architectural realities give him only material for free improvisation. Independently interpreting and conjecturing a literary plot, he becomes a full-fledged co-author of the book, and his heroes do not appear in their ordinary real appearance, but in the form of characteristic grotesque masks of some kind of mystical carnival. The illustrations by Alexander Kodiak are like a playful and naughty shadow, which constantly accompanies the main character of the story, but never exactly repeats his movements. Saying goodbye to the reader with a sad poetic testament, the new hero carefully enters the motley gallery of the St. Petersburg literary myth. We wish a long life to the newborn Chukonian Werther. Let, unlike its great predecessor, not serve as a guide to sad action, but, on the contrary, as a modest reminder of the elusive and returning moments of happiness, for which it is still worth living. Boris Ostanin. Thank you for downloading the book from the free electronic library royallib.com, https://royallib.com. Leave a review about the book, https://royallib.com/comment/Severyukhin_Demetri/Mitino_shas.html. All books by the author, https://royallib.com/author/Severyukhin_Demetri.html